This morning, our Health Education Committee had a hearing. One of the members came up to me on the floor and said, that was the most civil hearing I've attended in the Senate in a while. And the truth is, most of our hearings in the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee are civil. We have senators of widely different points of view, but I think Senator Murray, the senator from Washington State, who is the ranking member of our committee and a member of the Democratic leadership, for the way she and the Democratic members of the committee work with the Republican members so that we can have the Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Adams, and Dr. Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, who's one of our country's most esteemed scientists, the man who headed the Human Genome Project. We can have them there for 3 hours. We can ask questions. Virtually every senator participated, and we got some good answers. And I'd like to report to other members of the Senate about that hearing. I began it by saying I've been rereading the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, a book by Jared Diamond, written in 1997, which is as relevant today, maybe more relevant today than it is when he wrote it. Mr. Diamond, who won the Pulitzer Prize and is a professor of geography in California, said there's nothing new about mass epidemics that cause deaths and social upheaval that we're witnessing today. And there's nothing new about where most of those epidemics in history have come from. Diseases that cause those deaths for the last 10,000 years, he says, have come mostly from animals who transmit them to humans. And during most of history, there were 3 ways to deal with these epidemics. One was to isolate the infected, as in, for example, leper colonies, to deal with leprosy. One was to, according to Mr. Diamond, that over thousands of years, there have been genetic changes in the human population in response to the infectious diseases that have gone through those populations, and it has produced a resistance to the infection disease, as in the case of smallpox. But of course, that didn't do much to help the Native Americans in this country when European settlers who had some resistance to smallpox arrived here and gave blankets to the Native Americans that were infected with smallpox or contained smallpox, and wiped out 90% of the tribes who received them because they didn't have that resistance. And then there's a third way of dealing with epidemics. Throughout most of history, the most common way was to let it run. Let the epidemic run through the population until it had either killed or recovered everyone, until everyone had been either killed or recovered and developed some resistance to the disease. Diamond says that the Black Death killed about 1/3 of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351 as it ran through the population, killing people. Now, what's new about dealing with epidemics is modern medicine. Modern medicine has given us ways to diagnose these diseases and to create treatments to make it easier to recover from these diseases. But the true miracle of modern medicine, Madam President, is the vaccine. A vaccine that can prevent humans from acquiring the disease at all. The senator from Tennessee and I have actually worked together on that issue 2 or 3 years ago to encourage people, in her words, talk to your doctor if you have a concern about a vaccine. And that's what we want to talk about today. Today, in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, school children are required to take vaccinations for a series of diseases: diphtheria, tetanus, whooping cough, measles, rubella, chickenpox, before entering school. That vaccination will protect the child from getting the disease, which in turn prevents the child from infecting someone else, a pattern that eventually causes these diseases to disappear. Americans of my generation remember how polio terrified our parents in early 1940 and into the 1950s. Many saw their children die of polio. I can remember classmates when I was very young who were strapped into iron lungs so they could breathe and were destined to stay there for the rest of their lives. The lucky ones were like Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was only left with a limp after having polio in the 1940s. The disease terrified Americans until Dr. Jonas Salk discovered the polio vaccine in 1955. After the vaccine was developed, the United States undertook a large-scale vaccination campaign, and polio was declared eradicated from the United States by 1979. The purpose of the hearing that we had this morning was to explore the remarkable progression that science is making toward a COVID-19 vaccine, and to remind parents to have their children get their childhood vaccinations, and to encourage as many Americans as possible to take the flu vaccine this fall. First, the progress toward the COVID-19 vaccination. Dr. Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health, talked about that. He talked about the vaccine research and development, including Operation Warp Speed, which is working to develop, manufacture, and distribute safe and effective vaccines as rapidly as possible. He told us there are 6 vaccines currently under development. He reminded us that the federal government, using taxpayers' money, has helped accelerate this by providing money to manufacture these vaccines before they are deemed safe and effective, and that he does not necessarily expect all of the vaccines to work. And if they don't work, or if they're not safe, they'll be thrown in the dumpster. They'll not be distributed to anyone to use. He pointed out that AstraZeneca announced today that one person in its clinical trials, which probably has 30,000 people in the UK, had developed an illness, and they had paused the trial. In other words, they'd stopped giving shots to the volunteers in the clinical trial until they could see if the illness is related to the vaccine. Some people believe that Operation Warp Speed means cutting corners, but it is not. It means referring to the extraordinary investment in research, development, and manufacturing scale-up for the COVID-19 vaccine. Perhaps most significantly, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, we call it BARDA, has taken the unprecedented step, as I mentioned earlier, to speed up manufacturing for hundreds of millions of doses early in the process by buying those doses in advance so they can be ready to distribute as soon as the vaccines are approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Several of our senators on both sides of the aisle asked Dr. Collins and Dr. Adams, the Surgeon General, whether they intended to let politics play a role in the decision about whether a vaccine is safe and effective and ready for distribution. They answered absolutely no, that they would be no part of such a decision. The same has been said by Dr. Stephen Hahn, who is commissioner of the FDA, who's charged with making that judgment. This is going to be a science, medicine, data decision, he said. It's not going to be a political decision. That means if it's not safe, it won't be distributed. At the same time, the Centers for Disease Control is working on a plan to distribute the vaccine as soon as they're authorized or approved, prioritizing vaccines for healthcare workers and vulnerable populations. CDC says its plan will be a fair system informed by nonpartisan health experts from the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and others. Now, some have suggested, of course, this is a political season, we have election in 2 months, that the reason we're rushing as a government to create the vaccine is so that it will help President Trump before the election in November. Or that the reason that the Centers for Disease Control said to the states, get ready now to distribute the vaccine when it's effective and safe, that that's a political move. Of course, I said that if Dr. Collins and Dr. Adams had come in and said it would be 5 years before we had a vaccine, we'd probably ask the president to fire them because people are dying and we need vaccines. We don't want the alternative, which is to run run the disease through millions of Americans until everybody either dies or is infected and recovers. And we don't want to have happen again what happened before with the H1N1 virus, which was the vaccine was ready, but the states weren't ready to distribute. So we were pleased to see what the response was. Americans are saying that they might not take the vaccine. One, Madam President, the chamber's not in order.
The chamber should be in order. Please remove your conversations. Senator from Tennessee.
Thank you. First question that people ask is, are they safe? They're safe because they're reviewed by the FDA, which is the gold standard for safety. Vaccines are routinely given to children. They're specifically recommended by an advisory commission that looks at it carefully, by doctors and physicians and scientists. In a 2015 article for the Scientific American, a distinguished scientist wrote, quote, by age 2, most children will receive almost 30 shots designed to boost a child's natural defenses against disease. Yet at the same time, parents who take their children for those recommended vaccinations might be inundated with website and celebrity-espoused rumors making false claims that shots are not necessary or cause autism. At best, this distinguished scientist wrote, navigating this landscape can be confusing, but when weighing the risks of encountering life-threatening disease against the benefits of receiving a vaccine, there's no contest. The vast majority of children do not experience anything worse than short-lived redness or itching at the spot of the injection. And I asked Dr. Collins this question, which I think is confusing to some people. When you take the COVID vaccine, you don't get COVID. Now, there was a time in the old days when to get a smallpox vaccine, you in fact got a little smallpox. But that's not what happens. As Dr. Collins explained it, he said the vaccine creates a sort of machine within your body and your immune system to fight the COVID. It doesn't infect you with the disease. Then there's the question about whether the vaccines are effective. I've talked about how polio is now eradicated. The number of polio cases since the vaccines has fallen rapidly to less than 100 in the 1960s, less than 10 in the 70s, thanks to the successful vaccination program. According to the Centers for Disease Control, the United States has been polio-free since 1979. And diphtheria was a terrifying prospect for parents in the 1920s, but according to the scientific agencies in the government, there are only a few of those a year. And then there's a concern about whether the doctor's office is safe. I heard that from people, but the studies have shown that the pediatricians, and we heard that testimony today, have gone to great efforts to try to make their offices the safest places that a parent can go with their child in order to get a vaccination. Now, finally, Madam President, I started my comments this morning with comments from Jared Diamond, and I concluded with a warning he wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He said, in effect, that the main thing that's different about this disease, COVID-19, is not that it's more infectious. The main thing that is different is the jet plane. The plane that can carry people all over the world, all over our country, spreading whatever the infection is. And he said, as a result of that, the next pandemic could be next year. That's why I've introduced into the Senate legislation that would help prepare for the next pandemic. It has support on all sides. Senator Frist from Tennessee, the former majority leader, Senator Daschle, the former majority leader on the Democratic side, many experts all say that we have a problem in this country going from panic to neglect to panic. And while we've taken some important steps, as Senator Burr pointed out today, to create the authority for the government to build manufacturing plants, to manage stockpiles better, to be prepared for pandemics, that as soon as the epidemic is over, we move on to something else. So the time to deal with the next pandemic is now. So there is specific legislation to make sure that we sustain funding for onshore manufacturing, so we're not relying on China, India, other countries to make our vaccines for the next pandemic. There's money to make sure that the stockpiles are filled with protective equipment so we don't have the kind of delays that some people experienced in this pandemic. Former Governor Mike Leavitt said to our committee that we have underfunded public health for the last 30 to 40 years. And when we underfund public health and the next pandemic comes, we're not as ready for it as we should be. So, fortunately, thanks to an unprecedented effort by scientists around the world, preparation by Republican and Democratic administrations over the last 20 years, and several Congresses, we have done a lot to be well prepared for this pandemic. And we're moving more rapidly than we ever have to create new diagnostic tests, new treatments, and new vaccines. Some of the challenges that remain are how to distribute it, to whom it should go first, and how to persuade Americans it's safe to take it. But while we're in the midst of dealing with all this, it would be wise to remember that any legislation that we pass in Congress this year dealing with this pandemic should also take steps to make sure that our stockpiles are filled, that our manufacturing plants can stay functioning, and that public health state by state is well funded. Because, as Jared Diamond said, the reason to do that now, while our eye is on the ball, is because the next pandemic could be next year. I thank the President. I yield the floor.